Hello.
When I stepped into the art studio that evening, I wasn't thinking about anything more than killing an hour before dinner. My feet were sore from walking in unfamiliar heels all day, my phone buzzed with unread work emails, and my husband's last message, "don't forget to smile at the client." Still irritated me. But as I crossed that threshold and heard the faint sound of a pencil scratching against canvas, something in me paused. He was there, focused, not even noticing me at first. Just the way he held the charcoal. I don't know why, but it felt like he was holding a secret. A different kind of silence hung in the air, one I hadn't felt in years. I told myself I'd only stay 5 minutes. Just 5. But then he looked at me. Not like a man looks at a stranger, not like someone waiting for a client. He looked as if he had seen me before. As if he was remembering me, not discovering. My chest tightened. I should have left right then. I should have turned around, gone back to the hotel, and called my husband like I promised. But I didn't. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A small one at first. One that felt like nothing. Until it became everything. Let me tell you what really happened, before the whole story gets lost in someone else's version. Before it's rewritten by guilt or erased by shame. And as I tell you, ask yourself, have you ever done something irreversible, because, for just one moment, it made you feel alive again? I never thought of myself as a woman who could go unnoticed. Not because I'm particularly beautiful or extraordinary, but because I used to carry myself with a sense of purpose. Somewhere along the line, that purpose became everyone else's, my husband's, my grown daughters, my jobs. Not mine. This business trip was supposed to be just that, a meeting, a conference, a quiet room with coffee and numbers. A routine break from a routine life. But as the train pulled into the city station, I found myself looking out the window like a tourist instead of a manager. Watching the buildings flicker past, I didn't think of spreadsheets or tasks. I thought of how long it had been since I felt curious about anything. That realization settled into my chest like a stone. At the hotel, everything was as impersonal as I expected. Crisp sheets, neutral walls, complimentary mints. I unpacked methodically, blouses to the left, flats by the door, phone charger next to the bed. It felt familiar, automatic, like brushing teeth. Only when I sat on the bed and looked around did I realize how little of me was in that room. I went for a walk before dinner, just to stretch my legs. That's when I saw it, a narrow storefront tucked between a bakery and a travel agency. Atelier 34, the sign read. A red wooden door, a dusty window. The kind of place you pass without noticing unless something calls you inside. I hesitated. My heels ached. My head pulsed. And yet. I crossed the street. Inside, it smelled of linseed oil and something older, perhaps wood, perhaps memory. There were canvases leaning against every wall, some blank, some painted over in frustration. And him, he stood with his back to me, shirt sleeves rolled up, his forearm taut as he sketched. I must have made a sound because he turned, eyes meeting mine as if I were a late arrival he'd been expecting. "You're early," he said, and smiled like it meant something. "I'm just looking," I replied, unsure if I meant it. He nodded toward a stool near the window. "The light's better over there. You can stay a moment." I should have left. I knew better. But I sat. Not out of defiance or flirtation, but because it felt like the first unscheduled thing I had done in years. We didn't speak much. He returned to his sketching. I watched the way he moved, decisive, but gentle, like each line mattered. I thought about how my own life was drawn in thick, bold strokes, marriage, motherhood, work. No shading. No mystery. When I finally stood to leave, he looked up and said, "You'd make an interesting subject." For what? I asked, not understanding. He held up his sketchpad. For light and shadow. There's something unresolved in your posture. I laughed. That's just poor posture. But his expression didn't change. He wasn't flirting. He was observing. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of the hotel. I'd made no dinner plans. My phone lit up with a message from my husband, *, hope your day went smoothly. Call me if you get time. * I didn't. Not because I was angry or distant, but because I didn't know how to describe a day where nothing happened and yet everything felt different. The next morning, my meetings dragged. I gave polite smiles, took notes I wouldn't reread, drank coffee I couldn't taste. During a break, I caught myself checking my watch, not to keep track of the schedule, but to count how long it was until the gallery would likely reopen. By 5, I was back at the door. I almost laughed at myself, a grown woman loitering like a teenager. When I stepped inside, he didn't seem surprised. Still just looking, he asked. I think I'm still unresolved, I replied. He offered no chair this time, just a gesture toward the window light again. Would you mind, he asked. I don't know how to pose, I said. I'm not asking you to pose. I'm asking you to stay still and exist. So I did. He didn't talk, and I didn't either. I sat there, breathing, trying not to fidget, and wondering why this moment felt more intimate than any recent dinner with my husband. I thought about the last time someone really looked at me, not in passing, not out of duty, but with curiosity. When the session ended, he flipped the sketchpad shut and said, "You looked lighter today." I didn't feel it, I replied. He shrugged. Then maybe it's not your weight. Outside, dusk had already begun to fall. The streets were quieter. I realized I hadn't checked my email in hours. That thought should have panicked me. It didn't. Back at the hotel, I finally called my husband. He asked how things were, if the presentation went well. I told him yes. I told him about the meeting room, the taxi delay, the weather. I didn't mention the studio. Not because I felt guilty yet, but because I didn't know what it meant. But something inside me had shifted. A tiny tilt. Barely visible from the outside. But I felt it. And the truth is, those little tilts, those near invisible shifts in our lives? They're the ones that change everything. The next morning started earlier than I had planned. I awoke before my alarm, heart beating faster than usual, as if my body had registered something that my mind hadn't yet acknowledged. The room was filled with pale morning light, and for a few seconds I lay there, listening to the distant sounds of the city, trying to piece together the restlessness that had crept in overnight. My suitcase sat untouched in the corner. My blouse from yesterday hung neatly over the back of the chair, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the studio and the way he'd looked at me. Not romantically. Not even warmly. But attentively. It was the attention I hadn't known I missed until I received it. My meetings dragged. They were supposed to end by noon, but they stretched through coffee breaks, lunch, and an unscheduled call that no one could seem to wrap up. I watched the clock more than I listened to anyone. My colleague asked me twice if I was feeling well. I smiled, nodded, said I was just a bit tired. That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth was that something inside me had been stirred, and I had no idea what to do with it. By late afternoon, I found myself again standing outside the gallery. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the faint scent of turpentine greeting me like an old friend. The light was warmer than yesterday. The windows caught the sun at a different angle, throwing gold onto the floors. He was there again, not painting this time, but sorting through sketches. He looked up as I entered but didn't smile, didn't speak. I liked that about him, he didn't fill silence unnecessarily. I wasn't sure you'd come back, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I wasn't either, I replied, and sat down in the same place as before. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why I was back or what I wanted. Instead, he picked up a charcoal stick and motioned gently toward the window. I took off my blazer, it was too warm anyway, and settled into the light. For a long time, we said nothing. He sketched. I sat. And in that strange, suspended space, I stopped thinking. Not about work, not about home, not even about him. I just existed. Fully and entirely. It was a rare feeling. A dangerous one. I don't know how long we stayed like that. At one point, I shifted slightly and he looked up. You're thinking again, he said, not accusingly, but observantly. I never really stop, I replied. You should try. Just for an hour. Let someone else hold the noise for a while. That sentence stayed with me. Let someone else hold the noise. I didn't know what to make of it, but something in it felt like a key I hadn't realized I needed. When he finished, he set the sketchpad aside and looked at me longer than he had the day before. I felt my breath catch. There was no reason for it. No grand moment. No shift in music or tone. Just a look. One that said he'd noticed more than he let on. I stood to leave, brushing my hands on my skirt out of habit. You should see the courtyard out back, he said. Not many people do. It's quiet. Real quiet. Without thinking, I nodded. He led me through a narrow hallway and opened a door I hadn't noticed before. The courtyard was small, with ivy growing along the brick walls, a rusted metal table, two mismatched chairs, and the remnants of a terracotta pot cracked down the middle. A small tree grew out of the corner, its branches swaying in the light breeze. I come out here when I need to reset, he said. Sometimes the studio feels like too much. I sat without waiting for permission. He stayed standing, watching the sky. I haven't been alone in a long time, I said, the words slipping out before I could pull them back. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence felt like permission to continue. Even when I'm alone, I'm not alone. There's always something to answer to. Someone expecting something. Emails, dinner plans, phone calls. I think I forgot what it feels like to just sit. Without explaining anything. You're explaining it pretty well now, he said. We both smiled, but not at each other. At the air. At the idea that something honest had just been said aloud. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the edge of the gallery but didn't open the door. Tomorrow, he said. What about it? I'll be here. I paused, nodded, and left. I walked the streets slowly that evening. The sun was low, casting long shadows. I passed cafes and families and couples holding hands. I looked at them with detached curiosity, wondering how many of them were pretending. How many of them were simply performing togetherness. And how many, like me, were walking with a truth they hadn't told yet. Back at the hotel, I peeled off my clothes and stood in the bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror. The lines near my eyes were deeper than I remembered. The curve of my waist softer. My body didn't surprise me anymore. It didn't disappoint me either. It just felt familiar. Like furniture in a house you've lived in too long to notice. I ran a warm washcloth across my face and caught myself whispering, "What are you doing?" There was no answer, of course. Just the ticking of the travel clock on the nightstand and the hum of the city beyond the window. My phone buzzed. A message from my husband, *Hope your day went well. I'll call you tomorrow. Miss you. *. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down, walked to the window, and opened it. The breeze rolled in, not cold, not warm, just real. I leaned on the sill and watched the street below. A couple kissed under a flickering street lamp. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't movie-like. Just a brief, almost invisible kiss between two people who weren't thinking about anything else. And then, suddenly, we po. It happened in the memory, not in the moment. My mind's eye replayed it, the way he'd looked at me earlier, the silence that held more than speech, the way my breath had shifted. It hadn't happened, not yet. But it lived inside me now, forming roots. I stepped back, pulled the window closed, and returned to the bed. The message was still there, waiting. I typed a reply. Day went fine. Just tired. Talk tomorrow. Sent. Simple. True. But not the whole truth. Not anymore. The third morning in that city began with rain. Not a heavy downpour, but that persistent kind of drizzle that softens the edges of everything. From my window, the streets looked blurred, as if someone had wiped their sleeve across the canvas of the world. I dressed slowly, choosing a charcoal gray blouse I hadn't worn in months, one that had always felt a bit too elegant for the office but too reserved for anything else. Somehow it felt right today. My meetings were brief and forgettable. The clients nodded politely, agreed to timelines, and shook hands like people who had done it all before and would do it all again. I performed the part of the competent professional with ease, smiling when necessary, inserting the right phrases, but all the while, part of me watched from the outside. I kept checking the time without checking it. My thoughts circled around the studio like bees near a window, drawn in, unable to find a way out. When I finally stepped out into the rain, I didn't open my umbrella. I walked slowly, letting the mist settle on my hair and skin. It was grounding in a way I hadn't expected. By the time I reached the gallery, my shoes were damp and my blouse clung lightly to my back. I didn't care. The door was unlocked. The air inside was warm and dry, filled with the quiet hum of a single electric heater. He stood at the far end of the room, barefoot, wiping down a frame. His jeans were rolled at the ankle, a smudge of blue paint on his forearm. He glanced up. "You're wet." I walked. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Sit if you want." I was about to make tea. I settled onto the familiar stool, and he disappeared into the back. I heard the clink of mugs, the hiss of water heating. It was domestic in a way that felt deeply unfamiliar to me, not because I didn't make tea at home, but because no one there ever offered to make it for me without asking why or what for. He returned with two mismatched mugs, handed me one, and sat opposite me on a low stool. For a moment, we just drank. The silence wasn't empty. It was layered with things unsaid but understood. I looked around the room. A new canvas stood near the easel, half covered with charcoal lines, some erased, some reinforced. A woman's shoulder, the back of her neck, the suggestion of turned eyes. Something about it looked like me. Not precisely. But in essence. Is that? I started to ask. He interrupted softly. Not yet. Maybe later. We sat like that for a long time. At some point, I kicked off my shoes, tucking my feet beneath me. I hadn't done that in a public space in years. It felt like a small rebellion. A kind one. He asked no questions about my life, and I gave no answers. But the room was full of truths anyway. I knew, somehow, that he had lost someone once. Maybe not recently. Maybe not tragically. But the way he moved around the space suggested absence, that careful respect for things not there anymore. Eventually, I rose and walked to one of the finished pieces leaning against the wall. It was a man's face, etched with deep lines and quiet anger. The eyes were tired. Not sad, just tired in a way that spoke of long roads and not enough rest. I looked at it for a while before turning back to him. "You draw people the way they see themselves," I said. "No," he replied. "I draw them the way they won't admit they feel." That stayed with me. I returned to my hotel late that evening. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't turn on the TV. I undressed slowly, folded my clothes, and stood for a while in front of the mirror. The woman I saw there didn't look transformed. She wasn't radiant or broken or glowing with new life. But her eyes looked back with more intent than usual. As if, for once, she was fully present. I sat on the bed and scrolled through my phone. Dozens of emails. A few texts. One from my daughter asking if I'd remembered to call the dentist for her old insurance forms. Another from my husband, brief, * hope meetings were productive. Don't forget our anniversary dinner next week. Let me know if you want the usual place. *. The usual place. Always the same table, always the same wine, always the same conversation about work and plans for the weekend. It was never unpleasant. It was just predictable. A quiet routine, repeated enough times that it had worn smooth, like a stone in water. I started to type a reply. Then stopped. Then started again. In the end, I simply wrote, * long day. Will confirm when I'm back. *. I set the phone down and leaned back on the pillows, listening to the sounds outside. The rain had stopped, but the street still glistened with its memory. The thought of going back home felt heavier now. Not because I didn't love my husband. Not because anything terrible waited for me. But because something inside me had cracked open, and I couldn't pretend I didn't feel the draft. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something undeniable. A shift. A question. A pause in the middle of a long sentence I hadn't realized I was writing. And I didn't know how to unpause it. I slept fitfully, dreaming of rooms with high windows and sunlight that moved across wooden floors. In the dream, I was barefoot, walking slowly through a house I didn't recognize but somehow belonged to. There were paintings on every wall, none of them finished. And in every one, I saw myself, not the me from now, but versions of me I'd forgotten. Me at 17, laughing too loud. Me at 29, pregnant and scared. Me at 40, tired but still hoping. Me now, with my hands open but empty. When I woke up, the sky was pale again. Another day beginning. Another choice waiting to be made. But not yet. Not today. Today, I would go back to the studio. I would sit in the light. I would say nothing and hear everything. And maybe, just maybe, I would let myself be seen again. I woke the next morning with a strange sense of clarity, the kind that doesn't come from rest but from the weight of knowing what you want and still not knowing what to do about it. The rain had passed. The light that spilled through the curtains was clean, sharp, almost too honest. I sat up in bed and stared at the pattern on the hotel carpet. It was the same as every other chain hotel I'd stayed in, generic, neutral, comfortable. But something about it felt more foreign today than ever before. My phone blinked silently on the nightstand. I didn't check it. I already knew what would be there. A few unread work emails. A message from my husband, probably something about dinner reservations or the plumber or a funny article he'd read. We used to text like lovers. Then like friends. Then like administrators of the same quiet household. And now. I wasn't even sure what we were. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft beige sweater I'd brought on impulse. It was too warm for the weather, but it felt like armor. I skipped breakfast. Instead, I walked. Not toward the studio this time. Not yet. I needed to move without intention, to let my feet guide me before my mind caught up. I passed a bookstore, a cafe with mismatched chairs, an old woman sweeping the steps in front of her flower shop. Everything was ordinary, and yet I absorbed it all like someone starved for the textures of the world. Eventually, I found myself in the small park behind the museum. The benches were damp from the rain, but I sat anyway. A young boy kicked a soccer ball with his father across the lawn. A couple argued in hushed tones near a fountain. Life moved around me without requiring anything from me. For once, I wasn't a wife, a manager, a mother. I was just a body in a coat sitting under the remnants of yesterday's rain. The urge to see him grew quietly but insistently, like a soft knock on a closed door. I didn't want drama. I didn't want confessions. I just wanted the stillness he offered, stillness without explanation. By late afternoon, I returned to the studio. He was there, as always, not surprised to see me. His head tilted slightly as I walked in, as if noting something new in my posture. I didn't speak. Neither did he. Instead, I walked past the usual stool and stood in front of one of the unfinished canvases. It wasn't me, not exactly, but it was unmistakably inspired by my shape, my presence. The back of a woman's shoulder, the gentle slope of her neck, the suggestion of stillness just before motion. He joined me there, standing just behind my right shoulder. I could feel the warmth of his presence, but he didn't touch me. I was grateful for that. Words would have ruined it. I didn't come here to pose today, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, slowly. Then don't. We moved to the courtyard. The sun had returned, and the small tree in the corner swayed gently. I sat at the rusted table. He sat across from me, folding his hands loosely in front of him. The silence felt like something we shared now, not a gap to fill, but a bridge between us. I leave tomorrow, I said after a long while. He didn't ask where or why. It's not far, I added, as if that made a difference. He glanced at me. But far enough. I nodded. I wasn't sure if he meant distance or something else. I don't know what I'm doing, I said, and it surprised me how honest that sounded out loud. I don't think most people do, he replied. They just pretend better. It should have sounded cynical. It didn't. It sounded familiar. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The light shifted. The wind picked up. A door slammed somewhere in the alley behind the building. Life continued without asking us to participate. When I finally stood to leave, I didn't want to. But I did. I walked back through the studio, picked up my bag, and paused at the door. I'm not the kind of woman who does this, I said. I know, he replied. And we left it there. Back in the hotel, I packed slowly. Every shirt folded with more care than necessary. Every shoe tucked neatly into place. It felt ritualistic, like I was closing something fragile. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the suitcase. It wasn't heavy. But I was. My phone lit up. A message from my husband, asterisk I'm thinking we could try that new place for dinner next week. Change of scenery. Let me know what you think. Asterisk there was a warmth to it, a desire to keep things moving. I didn't hate him for it. I didn't even blame him. But it felt like we were always changing scenery without ever changing the view. I typed a reply. Asterisk maybe. Let's talk when I'm home. Asterisk it wasn't avoidance. It was the most honest thing I could say. Later that night, I stood at the window again. The city below was alive in its quiet way, streetlights flickering, distant voices echoing off buildings, cars moving like lazy fireflies. I wondered what it would feel like to belong to this place. Not just visit, not just pass through, but belong. To know which bakery had the freshest bread, which alley smelled of jasmine after the rain, which apartment lit its window with string lights all year round. The thought unsettled me. I returned to bed and lay there, eyes open, listening. Not for answers. Just for presence. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I dreamed of the studio again. Not as it was, but as something larger. The walls stretched upward endlessly. The windows had no glass. Wind moved through it like breath. And I stood there, not posing, not being watched, but watching myself from a distance, still, uncertain, but upright. When I woke, I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. A day, long ago, when I had sat in a cafe alone, writing in a notebook, imagining the kind of life I would build. I had written one sentence and circled it 3 times. Asterisk, I want to feel seen without being watched. Asterisk. Maybe that was all I had ever wanted. And maybe, for the first time in years, I had found it. Not in declarations. Not in certainty. But in the space between things. In the pause. In the quiet. I didn't know what tomorrow would ask of me. I didn't know what I would say when it did. But I knew this, I wasn't ready to let go of what I had found. Not yet. The train ride home felt both longer and shorter than I had expected. Time stretched oddly, bending between my thoughts and the blur of passing landscapes outside the window. I didn't listen to music or check my phone. I just sat in the window seat, staring at nothing and everything all at once. My suitcase was beside me, filled with the same clothes I'd left with, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was bringing back something heavier, something invisible but undeniable. When I arrived at the station, my husband was waiting, just like he always was. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, rocking slightly on his heels, scanning the crowd for my face. When he spotted me, he smiled, a warm, familiar smile. Not wide, not dramatic, but the kind of expression that said, "There you are. I knew you'd come back." He took my suitcase without asking, wheeled it behind us, and asked how the meetings had gone. I answered automatically. Productive. Long, mostly the usual. He nodded. We fell into silence, walking side by side to the car. It wasn't awkward, just practiced. On the drive home, he told me about the boiler making a strange sound, about a neighbor's new dog barking all night, about an upcoming dinner with friends. I listened. I nodded. I made the appropriate noises. But I wasn't really there, not fully. Part of me was still sitting in the art studio, with charcoal dust in the air and the echo of quiet breathing. At home, everything was in its place. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. The fridge was stocked. My mail was sorted neatly on the counter. My side of the bed had been freshly made. Nothing was wrong. And yet, nothing was right either. That evening, he made pasta. It was one of his favorite routines, chopping garlic with practiced hands, humming off-key to some old song he couldn't name. He poured me a glass of wine and asked if I wanted to eat in the dining room or in front of the TV. I chose the dining room. Over dinner, we talked about our daughter, her new job, her hesitation about moving in with her boyfriend. We talked about the weather. About whether or not we should repaint the guest room. He complimented my sweater. I smiled and thanked him. It was all easy. All safe. All surface. Afterward, he reached across the table and touched my hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not exactly. More like a familiar one. A reminder. A thread pulled taut. "I missed you," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him. His face was kind, aging gently, worn in all the places I knew by heart. There was no malice, no suspicion. Only warmth. But I couldn't bring myself to say, "I missed you too." Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't complete. I pulled my hand back gently and stood to clear the dishes. Later, in the bedroom, we undressed in silence, moving through the choreography we'd learned over decades. He lay on his side, reading an article on his tablet. I climbed into bed and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The hum of the house settled around us. I didn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open, heart too loud in my chest. I kept thinking about what it meant to be seen. Not just acknowledged, but truly seen. I'd spent so long playing the role of the steady wife, the dependable partner, the person who always had it together. And maybe I did. But it didn't feel like enough anymore. The next day, I returned to work. My office was just as I'd left it, files stacked, messages waiting, coffee growing cold in the usual mug. I moved through it all with efficiency, but my mind wandered. I caught myself staring at the framed photograph on my desk, the one of us from 5 years ago on vacation. We looked happy. And we were, in a way. But I also remembered feeling tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Tired of carrying everything without ever putting it down. That afternoon, my husband sent me a message, thinking we should book that anniversary dinner soon. The usual place? I stared at the screen. Something tightened in my chest. I typed, let's try somewhere new. And then I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. Instead, I replied, sure. The usual is fine. At home that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a cup of tea. The sky was soft with the fading light, and the street was quiet. I closed my eyes and let the air settle around me. I thought about the studio. About the way the silence there had never felt empty. About how, for once, I hadn't needed to explain myself. And then, quietly, not in reality. But in memory. That moment had rooted itself somewhere inside me. It replayed not as a fantasy, but as a fact of my emotional geography. A turning point. A knot in the fabric. I opened my eyes and looked around. Everything here was familiar, but it felt slightly out of focus. Not wrong, exactly. Just outgrown. That night, in bed beside my husband, I lay awake again. He reached for me once in his sleep, draped an arm across my waist. I didn't move. But I didn't lean into it either. In the dark, I whispered to myself, something is changing. And for the first time, I didn't try to stop it. The days that followed blurred together in a quiet routine that felt increasingly foreign. I went to work, answered emails, cooked dinner, folded laundry, nodded through conversations. On the outside, I was doing everything I was supposed to. But something beneath the surface had shifted. I moved through my life as if I were walking in shoes that no longer fit, still functional, but wrong in ways I couldn't ignore. I caught myself zoning out during meetings, fingers curled loosely around a pen I wasn't using. I looked out the window more often, even when there was nothing to see. The skyline didn't change. My to-do list didn't shrink. But my thoughts kept drifting, again and again, to that small studio, to the quiet courtyard, to the warmth of someone seeing me without needing to define me. At home, my husband tried. I could see it. He made reservations. He suggested a walk. He bought my favorite wine, even remembered the exact label. He asked about my day and really listened to the answers. But his efforts felt like someone trying to repair a window when the foundation was cracking. I appreciated them. But I couldn't meet them with the same energy. One evening, he brought up the idea of taking a trip together. Just the two of us. Maybe to the coast, or the cabin we used to rent when our daughter was still in school. I smiled and nodded, told him it sounded lovely. But my chest tightened. I didn't want to go away with him. I didn't want to pretend that things were the same. That I was the same. That night, I sat alone on the porch again, wrapped in the same blanket, the same cup of tea cooling in my hands. I stared into the quiet street and realized how much of my life I had spent waiting for things to get better, for things to make sense, for permission to feel something different. And now that I had felt it, I couldn't forget it. The next morning, I found myself looking at train schedules. It wasn't planned. I hadn't decided anything. But there I was, scrolling through departure times, comparing prices, watching the routes trace across the map like veins. I didn't book a ticket. Not yet. But I closed the browser with my heart beating a little faster than before. A week later, I received a message. Not from him, from the studio's official email. A mass newsletter. An upcoming exhibit. A few lines about the beauty of restraint and portraits of presence. There was an image embedded in the message. A new piece. Unfinished. Familiar. It wasn't me. Not exactly. But it felt like it had been born from that space between us. And seeing it stirred something in me that I had worked hard to keep still. That same afternoon, I stood in the middle of our kitchen and stared at the cupboards. Everything was in order. Spices alphabetized. Coffee mugs lined up neatly. Nothing out of place. And yet, I couldn't breathe. I walked to the bedroom, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and laid it on the bed. The sound of the zipper echoed in the room like a bell. I didn't pack right away. I just stood there, staring at the empty shell of it, wondering if I had the courage to fill it again. My husband found me there a few minutes later. He leaned in the doorway, watching silently. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked after a pause. "I don't know," I answered, which was true. He stepped into the room, folded his arms. "Is this about work? Or something else?" I didn't respond right away. My hands were resting on the edge of the suitcase, but I hadn't moved. "I just need space," I said finally. "From what?" he asked. "From me? From here? From everything," I whispered. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. That would have been easier, maybe. Instead, he sat down on the chair by the window and looked at me like someone trying to read a language they'd once spoken fluently but had long since forgotten. "I don't understand what changed," he said. "We were fine." "We were," I agreed. "But fine isn't enough anymore." Silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us could cross. "Is there someone else?" he asked. I looked at him then. Looked hard. He wasn't accusing me. He was grasping for something solid, something that could explain the fracture he could feel but not name. "There's someone I met," I said carefully. "But it's not about him." "Then what is it about?" I wanted to say everything. I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to tell him that I felt like a photograph that had been slowly fading in the sun, and that someone, a stranger, had simply noticed and said, "This still matters." I wanted to tell him that for the first time in years, I had felt like more than a role. Like more than a wife, or a mother, or a colleague. But all I said was, "It's about me." He nodded slowly. "I thought we were happy." "I think we were," I said. But maybe I wasn't. We didn't say much more after that. He left the room quietly. I didn't follow. I stood there for a long time, staring at the suitcase, still open, still empty. Later that night, I sat by the window with my journal. I hadn't written in it in months. Maybe years. I flipped through the pages and found an entry from a decade ago, scribbled on a random Tuesday. It said, "I wonder what it would be like to start over at 50. I traced the sentence with my finger. And then, softly, weep-ho. Not in the memory. Not in the moment. But in the way the past had begun to pull itself into the present. That kiss, simple as it was, had become a thread. And I had followed it without even realizing. I closed the journal and looked at the empty suitcase again. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. But I knew this, I couldn't unfeel what I had felt. And maybe, for now, that was enough. I woke before sunrise. The room was dark, the air still. My suitcase stood half-packed at the foot of the bed, the zipper part-way closed as if waiting for me to decide which direction my life was heading. I sat up slowly, the sheets falling from my shoulders, and let the weight of the moment settle over me. It was different this time. I wasn't leaving for work or out of obligation. I was leaving because I needed to. The house was silent as I moved through it. My husband had slept in the guest room again. Neither of us had said it aloud, but it was a mutual decision. Or rather, an unspoken one. We hadn't fought. We hadn't cried. We'd simply moved to opposite ends of the space we'd once shared. As I closed the suitcase, I paused to look around the room that had been mine for so many years. The photos on the dresser, the lamp with the chipped bess, the sweater draped over the chair. It all looked like my life, but it no longer felt like it. I left a note on the kitchen table. Nothing dramatic, just a few lines to say I needed time, that I wasn't running away, only stepping aside to find out who I was without everything else wrapped around me. I didn't know if he would understand. I hoped he would at least try. The train station was nearly empty when I arrived. I bought a one-way ticket without hesitation. There was no need for a return. Not yet. I sat by the window again, my suitcase tucked under the seat, my hands resting in my lap. The train pulled away from the platform with a slow shudder, and with each passing mile, the familiar gave way to the unknown. When I arrived in the city, I didn't call anyone. I didn't even check my messages. I took a cab from the station, giving the address with a kind of calm I hadn't expected. The streets looked the same. The corner cafe. The faded bookstore. The bakery that always smelled like cinnamon. I watched the buildings roll past as if I were returning to a place I hadn't just visited, but somehow belonged to. The studio door was closed when I arrived. I stood outside for a few minutes, unsure if I should knock. I hadn't told him I was coming. I hadn't promised anything. The wind tugged at the collar of my coat, and I felt a sudden flicker of doubt. But I knocked anyway. He opened the door with a rag in one hand, paint on his wrist, and a look that wasn't surprise but something quieter, recognition. He stepped aside without speaking, and I entered. The space smelled the same, a mixture of turpentine, dust, and old wood. The light was softer now, diffused through the tall windows. I set my suitcase down near the wall. We stood facing each other for a moment. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And then, slowly, we spent the night together. There are moments in life that don't need to be narrated. They don't require embellishment or retelling. They simply exist, imprinted not on the page but somewhere deeper, a place that memory touches but words cannot hold. The next morning, the world looked the same, but I didn't feel like the same person. I woke before him, the room still wrapped in shadows. I lay still, listening to the sounds of the building, the hum of pipes, the faint creak of wood. He stirred beside me but didn't open his eyes. I watched the curve of his shoulder rise and fall with each breath, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no rush to be anywhere else. Later, we sat at the small kitchen table, sharing coffee in silence. The mugs were mismatched. One had a chip near the rim. The sugar bowl was a repurposed candle jar. It was all imperfect, and yet it felt more grounded than anything I'd known in years. "I didn't expect you," he said finally, his voice low. "I didn't expect myself," I replied. He nodded and poured more coffee. Outside, the city had begun to wake. The distant sound of delivery trucks, voices, footsteps on the sidewalk. But inside the studio, time moved differently. I walked slowly through the room, pausing to look at the canvases. Some were finished. Others were abandoned mid-stroke. One in particular caught my eye, a new portrait, still rough, the lines uncertain. It wasn't me, but I recognized something familiar in the posture. A kind of waiting. A kind of hope. "Do you ever finish them?" I asked, still looking at the painting. "Sometimes," he said. "But some things aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to stay open." That sat with me for a while. I spent the rest of the day in the studio. I didn't pose. I didn't clean. I didn't help. I simply existed there, in the quiet, in the light. At some point, I started writing again. Just notes at first. Thoughts, pieces of moments, memories I hadn't allowed myself to revisit. He didn't interrupt. He just moved around me, working, humming, letting the space fill naturally. That night, I slept without dreams. Or maybe I had them, but they weren't intrusive. They didn't jolt me awake. I woke instead to the scent of coffee and the low rustle of paper. He was already at the table, reading something, his glasses slipping down his nose. I sat across from him, legs tucked under me, fingers wrapped around the warm mug he handed me. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. And somewhere in the stillness of that morning, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about escape. It was about returning, not to a place or a person, but to myself. And that was something I hadn't done in far too long. The days that followed didn't arrive with fanfare or clarity. They unfolded quietly, like pages in a worn book I had forgotten I was still reading. There were no dramatic declarations, no overwhelming sense of arrival, just simple routines that slowly rooted themselves into my body. Coffee in the morning. Light stretching through the tall windows. The sound of brushes tapping glass jars. My feet bare against cool wooden floors. I didn't know what I had expected after that night. Maybe some kind of shift in how the air felt between us. Maybe distance. Maybe more. But none of that came. We lived in a rhythm that didn't need defining. He painted. I wrote. We shared meals in silence and moments of eye contact that said everything without saying anything. It felt fragile in a way that made me careful with every movement. I found myself walking the neighborhood more, learning the shape of streets I had once passed through without paying attention. The bakery on the corner remembered me after 3 visits. The woman behind the counter handed me my order without asking, her smile kind but curious. I imagined what she thought of me, this quiet woman who showed up alone, always dressed neatly but plainly, who carried a notebook and never seemed to be in a rush. Maybe she wondered if I lived nearby. Maybe she thought I was an artist's wife. Maybe she didn't think of me at all. Sometimes I wondered that about myself. I didn't call home. I didn't check in. I didn't open the messages I knew were waiting. The silence was deliberate, not cruel. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just trying to hear myself think for the first time in years. But silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It collects weight over time. And eventually, it demands acknowledgement. One afternoon, as I sat by the window sketching thoughts into the margins of my journal, my phone vibrated with a familiar name. My daughter. I hadn't spoken to her since I left. The guilt came quickly, sharp and unexpected. I stared at the screen as it rang, and by the time I decided to answer, it had already gone to voicemail. Later that evening, I listened to her message. Hi, Mom. Just checking in. Dad said you were away but didn't say much else. I don't know what's going on, but I hope you're okay. Can you just let me know you're safe? That's all. I love you. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Not angry, not accusatory. Just unsure. The way I must have sounded 100 times in her childhood when I was waiting for her to explain something she didn't have words for yet. I replayed the message 3 times before deleting it. Not because I didn't care, but because it broke something open that I wasn't ready to face. That night, the quiet in the studio felt different. Not uncomfortable, but layered. As we sat across from each other at dinner, 2 bowls of lentil soup between us, I felt the tension I had been avoiding begin to creep back in. I haven't told them I'm here, I said, barely louder than the hum of the radiator. He nodded slowly. You don't have to explain anything to me. I know, I replied. But maybe I need to explain it to myself. He set his spoon down and folded his hands. You don't owe anyone anything, not yet. You're allowed to take time. But for how long? I asked. At what point does time become selfishness? He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have thoughts, but because he respected mine too much to fill the space with his own. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I thought of my husband, sitting at the kitchen table alone. Of my daughter, checking her phone for a message that hadn't come. Of the woman I had been 6 months ago, measured, composed, always where she was expected to be. She wouldn't have recognized the woman I was now. And I wasn't sure I did either. The next morning, I wrote a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A letter, by hand, in long uneven lines. I told them I was safe. That I wasn't lost, just in the process of finding. That I loved them, but that love wasn't always the same as staying. I didn't make promises. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I simply wrote what was true. I walked it to the post office myself and dropped it in the box. The sound of it hitting the metal felt louder than it should have. Like closing a door softly, knowing you wouldn't knock again for a while. Back at the studio, he was working on a new piece. The canvas was large, nearly the height of the wall. He didn't look up when I entered. I sat in the corner and watched as he moved, confident, quiet, deliberate. There was peace in his presence. Not comfort. Not distraction. Peace. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. When he finally stepped back from the canvas, he caught my eye and smiled. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or invitation. Just recognition. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I opened the window and let the air move through the space. It smelled of dust and paint and the faintest hint of jasmine from the courtyard. I stood there for a long time, arms resting on the sill, feeling the shift of light on my skin. I thought about what it meant to rebuild a life. Not from ruin, but from repetition. To take what still worked and lay it down in a new shape. Not better. Just more honest. And then, without needing to close my eyes, I remembered. WIPO. The memory returned like a tide, soft, inevitable. Not because it defined me, but because it had marked the moment everything changed. A quiet turn, a step taken without knowing the full direction. I didn't know what came next. I wasn't asking for clarity anymore. But I was beginning, finally, to understand the quiet power of choosing myself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The seasons had begun to shift. I noticed it first in the mornings, the way the light lingered just a little longer across the floorboards, how the air in the studio moved differently when the windows were open. It wasn't cold yet, but it wasn't summer anymore either. That kind of change, the kind that doesn't announce itself but accumulates quietly, had begun to mirror what was happening inside me. I had lived in this city for several weeks now, long enough that the rhythm of it no longer felt foreign. I knew which cafe opened early, which market sold the freshest bread, which street to avoid when school let out. I had routines, not obligations. I had space, not silence. And still, some part of me waited for the certainty that I had done the right thing, made the right choice, followed the right thread. But certainty never came, and I was slowly making peace with that. Each morning I woke early, not out of habit but because my body had adjusted to the way the light nudged me awake. I would stretch in the quiet, pad barefoot to the kitchen, make coffee, and then sit in the chair by the window and write. Not stories. Not letters. Just pieces of myself I had never written down before. Memories, fragments of conversations, fears I hadn't admitted even to myself. Some pages I tore out. Some I folded and tucked into books. Others I left alone. He never asked what I wrote. He never tried to read over my shoulder. I appreciated that. There's something sacred about being left alone in your own thoughts. The studio remained a place of quiet creation. He painted steadily, never rushing, never stopping. Sometimes he muttered to himself when something wasn't working. Sometimes he hummed. I liked the days when the music came low from the old speaker in the corner, jazz, mostly, or instrumental pieces that let the room breathe. He never demanded my attention. He never asked me to stay. But he always looked up when I entered, and that was enough. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor with a worn broom, I caught sight of a small canvas tucked behind a stack of old frames. Curious, I pulled it out. It was one of the first portraits he had ever sketched of me, incomplete and slightly smudged. The posture was uncertain, the expression guarded. But it was undeniably me. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it back where I had found it. Not because it hurt, but because it reminded me of how far I had come from the version of myself that had once sat in that very light, unsure of everything. Later that day, as we shared a meal of roasted vegetables and rice on the floor, because the table was covered in tools and canvases, I found myself asking a question I hadn't planned. Do you ever get tired of starting over? He looked at me for a long time before answering. Starting over isn't the hard part, he said. It's not knowing when you've really begun. That sat with me. Long after the dishes were cleaned, after he returned to his work, after I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the building. I kept thinking about the difference between running away and starting over, about whether I was still in motion or if I had, without realizing, begun to root myself again. I hadn't contacted my husband since sending that letter. I didn't know if he had received it. I didn't know if he wanted to respond. But one morning, my phone lit up with a new message, his name on the screen like a bell I hadn't expected to hear again. The message was short, *I got your letter. I don't know what to say, but I wanted you to know I read it. *. I stared at it for a long time, then turned the phone over and let it face down on the table. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not at all. That same day, while out buying fruit from the vendor near the corner, I ran into a woman I had met weeks before. She was older, wore a scarf in her hair, and walked with a limp. We had exchanged pleasantries once in line at the bakery. This time, she greeted me like a neighbor. You look settled, she said, not unkindly. I didn't know how to respond. I smiled instead. You live nearby, she asked. Sort of, I replied. She looked at me a moment longer, then nodded. You've got that look. People who come from somewhere else but stay long enough to forget what they were trying to leave. I thought about that the rest of the day. That evening, I returned to the studio and began organizing the books stacked near the back wall. It was a mindless task, but somehow comforting. Among them, I found a small, weathered journal. It wasn't mine. I flipped it open and saw his handwriting, sketches, notes, pieces of thoughts he'd never shared. I closed it gently and placed it back. Some things are better left unread. Some things are better felt in silence. That night, as I sat in the courtyard alone, wrapped in a sweater, the air cool against my skin, I thought about all the women I had been. The woman who folded laundry in the same way every Sunday. The woman who stayed up late finishing emails. The woman who smiled in photographs but never liked her own reflection. And the woman I was now, quiet, unsure, but unafraid of her own company. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's radio played softly through a window. I couldn't make out the words, only the gentle rise and fall of melody. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. And in the stillness, weep-ho. The memory remained, not because I clung to it, but because it had become a part of me. Not a secret. Not a betrayal. Just a moment that had cracked something open and allowed light to pour in. Tomorrow, I would write again. I would walk again. I would move through this city like someone who was no longer just passing through. And maybe, just maybe, I had finally begun. It was the first morning in a long time when I woke without the weight of doubt pressing on my chest. The light through the window was gentle and steady, casting long shadows that slowly shifted as the sun rose higher. I lay in bed, letting the stillness wrap around me like a warm blanket. For a moment there was no past, no future, just the quiet presence of now. The studio was quiet when I arrived, the air cool and tinged with the familiar scent of paint and wood. He was already there, bent over a canvas, hands stained and focused. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment, feeling a calm settle in my stomach. No words were needed between us. There never were. I unpacked my small bag and set my things aside. The space felt like a sanctuary, an imperfect refuge where the edges weren't sharp and the expectations weren't suffocating. I moved to the window, where the morning light pooled in a golden pool. The day stretched ahead, uncharted and open. I took out my journal and began to write. Not about him, not about us, but about myself, things I had hidden even from my own thoughts. Memories, hopes, fears. The cracks and the light that seeped through them. Hours passed like that. The world outside carried on, distant and unimportant. Here, in this room, I was simply a woman reclaiming the fragments of her life, gathering them one by one. Later, we ate quietly. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, fresh fruit. The comfort of plain things shared in peaceful company. We spoke little, but every glance, every gesture was rich with meaning. I thought of the letter I had left behind, the silence I had maintained with the people I once called family. I didn't know what the future held, only that I was no longer afraid to face it. When night fell, I stood by the window again, the city lights flickering like distant stars. I breathed in the cool air and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. And with that thought, I closed my eyes and let the night carry me forward.
Bye.